Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third week in our series with Cohen. We're very excited about tonight's speaker. And again, it's somebody who I've got to know through the work we do here in Mizrahi UK, especially with our Weekend of Inspiration. Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody joined us last year. Unfortunately, this year, no one could join us due to the pandemic. And of course, there's two things linked together for tonight's talk. So I'd like to introduce Rabbi Brody to you tonight. Rabbi Brody is somebody who, as I said, is the founder director of Tikva Overseas Students Institute and runs a new Jewish Law Live Facebook group and YouTube channel, and therefore is very much an expert in these areas. He's been called, cited in various Supreme Court decisions, and his first book, A Guide to Complex Contemporary Halachic Debates, published by Magid, received a 2014 National Jewish Book Award. And of course, at the moment, this area of the pandemic of doctors are very much on the forefront of all our minds, and we are tremendously grateful for the incredible work done by doctors and nurses here in the UK, in the NHS, of course, across all medical systems across the world that have helped us cope with this terrible pandemic that has swept the globe. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody. Good evening. Lovely to see you.
Love to see you as well. Thank you for having me.
And it's 10:30 in Israel, so apologies for keeping you up a bit later than normal, but this is the time works for the UK. And sorry we couldn't see you this year live in the UK. We loved having you last year for the Inspiration Weekend, and please got another time soon. You can join us back here in the UK. But certainly the topic with doctors serving a pandemic is incredibly relevant to what's been happening over the last few months across the globe. So I look forward to hearing from you. And what we're going to do is, obviously, during this talk, please do send in either on Facebook or YouTube comments that we can ask Rabbi Brody after his talk. And obviously, as it says below, any book you order from Cohen, which we're working with on this series, there is free shipping to the UK during this 6-week course. So without further ado, I look forward to hearing, and I'll speak to you afterwards. But Rabbi Brody, the doctors and pandemics, looking forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Shah, and it's great to be with you virtually, and I hope, please God, that I'll have opportunity to come back to be with you live in person in the near future. And as you said, Rabbi Shah, the question of, it's not really only doctors, of course, it's all healthcare professionals that have really been on the front lines, as it were, of treating this pandemic and addressing the challenges, the medical challenge that we're all facing. And really, I want to dedicate this year in honor of all of those healthcare professionals that are going above and beyond the call of duty, or as we'll see, or as I'll argue tonight, might be at least above and beyond the call of duty. All of those healthcare professionals who are serving us, whether it's in the UK or here in Israel or in America or anywhere else around the world. Tragically, as many of us know, in many places, there have been deaths, in fact, of healthcare professionals who've been treating corona patients who exposed themselves, particularly in the early months of the pandemic, when there wasn't a certain amount of knowledge around about how this worked, how the virus worked. And moreover, in certain countries, there is a shortage of personal protective equipment, PPE, and exposing certain doctors and nurses and others to the virus in ways which unfortunately led them to be severely sick and in certain cases die as well. So this is a really acute issue. And I'd say that along with the triage questions of the ventilators and whatnot, it's probably, in my mind, one of, if not the prime ethical dilemma of our time period. And I want to frame it tonight in a way in which I hope that we'll agree that I think Jewish law, the halakha, the Jewish values, has something to share with us about how to address this issue, that can provide us with a framework, with a moral framework of how to think about this dilemma. And while I don't know if we'll come to a clear-cut conclusion, although I certainly have my opinions on this issue, I very much hope that we'll find ourselves enriched by the Jewish sources and Jewish wisdom that will help us think about this deep, perplexing dilemma. And so let's jump right into it. I have prepared a bit of a source sheet here for us, and hopefully we'll be able to utilize it just to give ourselves a little bit of a framework of thinking of the issues. As we're going to see tonight, This is certainly not the first time that Jews have had to deal with this issue. And certainly not the first time, of course, the world has had to deal with this issue. But even dealing with pandemics, particularly in the 19th century, the issue came up with cholera and other circumstances as well. But the issue goes to a core of medical care as a whole, and not just medical care, but the notion of duties and rights. And what I want to try to do tonight is understand that there's a balance within Jewish thinking of a general understanding of the duty on the one hand to save others, while at the same time to protect oneself and to save oneself and to preserve one's own life. From there, we'll understand there's a spectrum of cases in terms of how to balance these various values. And then from there, we'll get into some of the issues that came up historically in times of plagues. Because what we're going to try to do tonight is shift initially to speak about the general obligation to heal, the general obligation to save others, and then go into particular questions about whether healthcare professionals have a particular or a special duty or unique responsibility in order to treat those that are ill in these types of circumstances. As we'll also see, this is not unique to Jewish ethical thought. There are many ethicists around the world from various faith traditions and various philosophical schools of thought who also have addressed these issues, and we're going to try to refer to some of them as well as we go along. So the first sources that we're going to see tonight deal with, just in general, lay out for us a certain type of duties, of responsibilities. And the first source that we're going to see is a Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin, Masechet Sanhedrin, which lays out the general responsibility. Jews have a duty to save others. You have a responsibility to save others when their life is endangered. So the Gemara says, the Talmud says that if you see someone who's drowning in a river, or an animal or bandits are attacking them, you're able to save them and you don't, you violate the prohibition of thou shalt not stand idly over the blood of your friend. Lo tamod adam re'echa. The Rambam Maimonides codifies this as well. And in general, of course, there's always a balance and a question. Wait a minute, what happens if the danger of me saving the other person is so great that I endanger myself? And Rabbi Caro, the Shochan, and others think about this issue. But in general, the rule of thumb is, well, you of course should save others, but it shouldn't be a suicide mission. So if it's a little kiddie pool and you see, God forbid, a baby drowning, so obviously you have an obligation to go and to step into the kiddie pool and save the baby. But if they were talking about rapid currents and you're not a great swimmer and the person drowning doesn't seem to be able to be saved so easily, so then you have to weigh and balance it out and understand that you have a counter responsibility at that moment. The counter responsibility is to save your own life, right? Because of the notion that we have, which says that we should live by the mitzvot and not die behem. V'chai behem v'lo she'amut behem. And so there's this responsibility, there's this balance at the get-go, which we understand of two duties. On the one hand, to live, to keep yourself alive, and on the other hand, lo tamod adam re'echa, right, to not stand idly by your fellow when they are endangered. And the Talmud actually asked the question, of course, well, how do we know, how to balance these two different responsibilities? A number of circumstances we can imagine. And the Talmud gives a very dramatic case in which Rebbe Imi, one of the Amoraim, was captured, was in danger, and in captivity, and there's a debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What should we do in this circumstance? And Rabbi Yochanan said, well, there's nothing to do, prepare the burial shrouds. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, perhaps drawing upon his earlier years before he became religious, when he himself was a bandit, and he said, no, I'm either going to die or I'm going to either kill someone or be killed, meaning I'm going in to save him. I'm going to risk my life and try to save him. And in this case, in fact, it worked out, right? He was successful. But the question is, right, is that the normative rule? Do we always say that you have such an obligation to endanger yourself to that extent to save someone else? And indeed, there are some figures over the generations, Jewish law decisors, who say that one has a responsibility to enter into a suffix, enter into a moment of doubt, of uncertainty, where you endanger yourself, but someone else's life is clearly for sure endangered. So their for sure being endangered trumps your, well, maybe I'm endangering myself. And therefore you have an obligation to go and to endanger yourself to save others. However, that is not the mainstream, that is not the majority position. Meaning Reish Lakish might have been a hero in that moment, but most Jewish authorities, legal authorities over the years in the poskim, as the Aruch HaShulchan note, says that the obligation ultimately of saving your own life, of preserving your own life, trumps that of saving others. However, as we can all easily and quickly imagine, there's going to clearly be a certain amount of a spectrum of cases here, which we have to think about and lay out in terms of how to think about this question. So if you think about it for a moment, so there's I won't show you the sources inside here, but there's a very fascinating discussion in the 16th century. Suppose you were told that your friend's in captivity and the bandit or the king will let them out, on condition, though, that you have your arm amputated. It seems like a crazy case scenario, but the principle that it comes out of it is very important. And there, the Radbaz in the 16th century said, no, of course not, right? How can it be that we tell someone to have their arm amputated? But clearly, at the same time, there's a certain spectrum, right, where the amount of endangerment isn't so great. So to come up with a contemporary example, are you obligated to donate blood? Right, which is minimally for a vast majority of people, it's really not dangerous at all if your blood is needed to save someone else's life. There, the answer seems to clearly be yes. What about bone marrow transplants? Again, the danger today with bone marrow transplants is very, very minimal. I believe, following many other poskim, that the one is obligated, if they're a match, to donate bone marrow. What about donating a kidney? Okay, giving up a kidney, that procedure a little bit more dangerous. And here you might not say that person is obligated to donate, but it's certainly permissible. It's certainly a mitzvah to donate a kidney. And thank God many have done so in the past few decades. Right, so you understand now that there's this balance of duties here that come into play in general, which we think about when we go into the questions of how far does a person have to go in order to save someone else's life, balancing these duties of endangering themselves or not endangering themselves and saving others. Now, this is a general rule, right? These are general ideas. But what about when it comes to the questions of saving, what about it comes to the questions of doctors, of healthcare professionals? And when I use the term doctors here, again, I mean it in the generic sense. I'm talking about healthcare professionals as a whole. Because here you might say that the sources that we've been talking about until now are pretty much focused on very general figures in the community, right? These are mitzvot, these commandments apply to all of us. But when it comes to the issue of healthcare professionals, you might say they have a very particular responsibility, a unique responsibility, what the philosophers say, like they refer to as a special obligation. Right, that somehow, because of their training, their knowledge, their unique contribution to society, they have an obligation to act. In fact, you might think of this, and we'll see coming up that this analogy might be particularly apt, very similar to, for example, to soldiers. Right? Soldiers are specially trained to guard and protect, and security officers in general. And therefore, let's just take a simple example. When it comes to God forbid, right, an incident, a terrorist attack, whatever it might be. So we expect the soldiers to run in, right, and attack the terrorists, while we don't expect the same from others who are allowed to flee. Or to give another, more perhaps a better example, firefighters. Right? So clearly they're specially trained, and we assume that they have some form of a special obligation in which we expect them to go into sometimes burning buildings, right, in order to save those who normally, of course, from the average Joe, for the average citizen, we would not expect them to go into that burning building. But if you think about the analogy to firefighters for a moment, or to lifeguards or many other examples, right, we understand that at some point, that special obligation still cannot obligate them to do a suicide mission, right? So if the building is falling, if it's collapsing, there are times when we tell firefighters, not only are you not obligated to go into that building, but you shouldn't go into that building. So let's think, if we can then, for a moment, once again, with regard to thinking about questions of the special obligations that doctors may have. Let's see if I can, apologies here, I'll just pull this back up for a moment. And here we go to the verses in Shemot, the Psukim in Shemot, where we're told that v'rapo v'yirapeh, right? There's this notion of someone is sick, they shall surely be healed. And from here, the Gemara deduces this notion that doctors have permission to heal. Why do you say they need permission to heal? After all, should this be an obligation? And many understand that sometimes that doctors might cause harm when they're treating, and they might even do worse things, but those things happen. But nonetheless, we want to tell doctors, nonetheless, go ahead, right, and treat, because overall, we think this is something you should do. In fact, not only do they have permission, as the Shulchan Aruch says, mitzvahi uv'chal pikuach nefeshu, right? This is a part of an obligation that they have to save others. Ve'im moneh atzmo harei ze shofech damim. This is very, very important. And the Shulchan Aruch concludes that if a person abstains from helping someone when they can, it is as if they've spilled blood. So a simple example, you're on an airplane, they say to you, is there a doctor on the plane? I mean a real doctor, right? Not like me, like a PhD, but a real medical doctor. Is there a real medical doctor on the plane? So if you like say, no, I'm not in the mood to help, right? So you might be a shofech damim in this case. It's very severe, this notion of understanding that you have a unique obligation because of the special training that you have. Now, in fact, therefore, we have this notion that we can't have a city at all, right? No, you shouldn't live in a city. You shouldn't build a city, right, that doesn't have a doctor in it, right? That's how important, of course, healthcare professionals are to society. However, doctors, like everyone else, also have the obligation to care for themselves. So to give a very interesting example that came up here in Israel, and was asked to Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein, one of the important poskim of Bnei Brak. So he's asked the following question. There's a children's doctor, a woman doctor who was pregnant. And in the war that she was in, there is a child that was sick with rubella, and there was a risk that she would be infected, right, from this child. Does she have an obligation here to treat the child, thereby endangering herself and her unborn fetus? And Rabbi Zilberstein said, no, right? No, you don't have that obligation to go treat in such a circumstance. But of course, here, it was a lot easier for him to say that, because while presumably it's dangerous for this particular doctor who's pregnant, there will be other healthcare professionals in your average hospital who would not be endangered, and therefore you can hand it over, right, that responsibility to someone else, right? So when society has to think about that balance of having a healthcare system in general, but also worrying about its healthcare professionals as individuals, so in that case, we can have someone else who's not pregnant treat the child with rubella. But when it comes to a pandemic raises much broader questions and much broader challenges, because already in Talmudic times, there's an understanding. And of course, the history of plagues, as we've all become familiar with in the last few months, I'm sure many of us have been studying this and reading about it, right, is very prominent. It's something which is shocking, I think, in many ways for those of us in the 21st century who didn't really imagine ever thinking of having to live through something like this. But of course, this is well known in antiquity and medieval time period and beyond. And the Talmud is very sensitive to this idea that people, when there's a time of suffering, when there's a plague, right, people should either flee when they can, or that they should go into their houses, right? They should lock themselves up, as it were, right? And they should be praying and all, et cetera. But there's this notion of saying that when you have an opportunity to flee, get out of there, right? Get away from the famine, or excuse me, get away from the plague that might be threatening you. And therefore, there's this dilemma already that emerges in Talmudic text. And it comes up not just with healthcare professionals, but it comes up even with communal leaders, right? Think about it for a moment. If you imagine you're, let's say, medieval town, and there's a plague, and so some people can flee, some people won't be able to flee. Well, if you're the rabbi or the communal leader, what does that mean for you to flee in that circumstance? Is it permissible for you to flee or not? On the one hand, you might say, oh, the captain has to stay with the ship, right? We don't want to have people leaving. It's important to give support and guidance. It's important to help structure and keep the community organized. On the other hand, how much is the rabbi really going to be able to do to help and deal with a plague? And maybe he should go and save himself. Right? And as the Maharshal in the 16th century and as Yamshel Shlomo points out, right, there is this notion of historically of seeing that many people just said, listen, what can I do? How can I help here? Right? And so while in general, we tell people don't be Porish Minat Tzibor, don't abandon your community, maybe there are times when your duty is actually to save yourself because that's the best thing in this circumstance. But when it comes to healthcare professionals, as opposed to, say, a rabbi or some other spiritual leader, communal leader, here the dilemma is much greater because we understand, right, that it's one thing if a rabbi would leave. It's one thing if some other support system leaves. It's another thing if the whole system, the whole chance that we have of pushing back against the pandemic is relying upon certain people who have this special duty. And if they flee the battlefield, and here I think the analogy is apt, well, then the whole city, the whole country might fall apart. And so the question becomes, well, what do we do in these circumstances? What do we expect from our healthcare professionals, from our doctors to do in such a scenario? And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you think about it, we have many historical case examples of thinking about this dilemma. And I want to focus for our purposes tonight on what I think has the most thorough halachic discourse relating to the great pandemics of cholera in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The world had 5 different cholera pandemics, and so this issue came up a lot of times. Certainly Jewish communities, like everyone else, was equally plagued by cholera and other types of virus pandemics. There's a myth out there that Jews thought or felt, or others thought or felt, that somehow because of Netilat Yadayim, of hand washing rituals, or other forms of rituals, we somehow were removed or we had a decreased amount of exposure. This seems to be historically not true. Doesn't make much sense once we know contemporary science. And by the way, historically, it wasn't understood to be the case as well. So in the 19th century, the question comes up with cholera. And the question becomes, well, what do we do in this circumstance? What do we do in this circumstance? What do we anticipate? Someone is sick here. Do we expect the doctor to go and treat the person? And so I want to show you a couple of interesting cases that came up in the early 1830s. There's a breakout of cholera in Central Europe, in places like Germany and elsewhere, and throughout Europe as a whole. And one of the important poskim of the time period, in his Sefer of Tiferet Yisrael, says the following: if a person has an illness which is contagious, choli hamit dabeket, right, that it can be spread easily, right? Afilu safek, and even if it's a safek midabeket, we're not sure, to cholera, right, like cholera of our time, asur lisko Yisraelim l'shamsho lekavar mitav, right? We do not hire, right, members of our community to help or assist them, or even to bury them. And this is a major issue historically. Do we expect people to bury those who have died, those who are victims of contagious diseases? And you see that there is actually an opinion which says that no, right, we don't expect people to do that. In fact, maybe we shouldn't, right? It's prohibited for a person to endanger themselves in such a manner. But while this position certainly is out there, you see echoes of it as well in the beginning of World War I, when there was also a lot of infectious diseases going on, and some of the Chubot discussed that issue as well. But by and large, this was not the majority position. And I want to understand why. Why is it that the poskim of the 19th century felt it was very important to say that, no, the healthcare professionals, the doctors of the time period, they must treat. They have a duty to treat. And here, there are a few sort of well-known stories which I think are worthwhile of sharing. One of which comes, again, from the same outbreak in 1830, 1831, 32. You see a letter from Rabbi Akiva Eger, again in Germany at the time period, who talks about this idea of saying that, no, we have an obligation as a community to pay and to hire people to take care and treat the patients, the sick people. And this is part of what we expect, we anticipate, right? Understanding that we have an obligation to make sure that we treat people. In Nefesh Harav, which is a book about stories told about or by Rav Soloveitchik, he discusses his grandfather, Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, towards the end of the 19th century, when there's a cholera outbreak in Brisk and Lithuania, and Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, insisted that we should follow the model of Reish Lakish that we've seen earlier, and said that we go and we help people and we endanger ourselves, because while we might be a suffect, we might be perhaps endanger ourselves, we know for sure that if we don't help others, they will die. And in fact, Rabbi Soloveitchik goes on to say that there are times when he himself went and helped carry people who had fainted and or dehydrated, whatever it might have been from cholera, and took them to the hospital, and he himself took hold. And Rabbi Soloveitchik goes on to say a very sobering moment. It's a very inspiring passage. But he says that his grandfather, Chaim Soloveitchik, was fine. He didn't get sick, but others who followed that model did get sick, and some of them died as well. And so you see from that story that we're very much aware of the fact that when it comes to contagious diseases, telling someone you have a duty, then we say you have an obligation to treat, to help, to serve, right, is really life endangering. And so the question becomes, well, how can we demand such a thing? Right? What is the basis of this? Because we saw earlier that there's a limit to what we expect from people to do. So why is this any different from, let's say, having your arm amputated, right? Why is this different from a situation where we say that this is just too dangerous for you? And this is not something we don't expect individuals to, we don't expect something that is a duty, as an obligation, to go jump into the river and save someone. Right? So why are you telling doctors and physicians that they have a duty to do so? In fact, I'm thinking right now in the back of my mind, a week or two ago, here in Israel, in the Kinneret, I believe it was, there was a young mother and a couple of kids who were drowning, and just a good random citizen jumped in, saved the mother and the two children, and unfortunately he passed away, though. He drowned after he had saved them. Right? So it's a tremendous act of heroism, a tremendous act of saving others, but would you say you have a duty to do so? And this issue has come up in the 20th century poskim as well, and they have talked about this, and they continue to reinforce this idea nonetheless. And I want to look at their writings to understand where this comes from. Okay? If you look at the writings of the Shevet HaLevi, Rav Wosner is a contemporary posek in Bnei Brak. So he says, of course, in the case of an infectious disease, in the outbreak of a plague, whatever it might be, I certainly expect and demand, it's forbidden for doctors to leave their post. Okay? And he gives two different rationales. One, he says, we have a precedent from 19th century, the cholera outbreaks. And two, he says, there are codes today for medical professionals. And when a doctor becomes a medical professional, he takes upon him or herself, right, the obligation to treat in such circumstances. Now, it's fascinating that Rav Wosner invokes these medical codes, and it's fascinating that he thinks that this is somehow obligatory in some sense, right? That it binds us because of the oath or the code that person might have accepted. But if you look in contemporary codes, it's very fascinating to see it's not always so clear-cut. I mean, at one time it was. So, for example, there's a famous code in the middle of the 19th century in the United States where it was very, very explicit that we expect physicians to stay on call and to treat patients even in the time of a plague. But in contemporary medical codes, it's not always that so explicit. I'll give you one example. When Sars outbreak happened in the beginning of 2003 and 4, particularly in Canada, so what exactly went on in Toronto and other places like there? So many healthcare physicians stayed on duty, but it was known sort of quietly that some said, this is just insane. I can't come to work like this. And some, in fact, didn't show up to work. And soon afterwards, the Canadian healthcare professionals came up with, redevised their new code. And it's a little bit ambiguous. It's not so clear. It's not explicit at all that they expect healthcare professionals to endanger themselves in this manner. I mean, let's think about it for a moment. You know, when a person goes to medical school, are they anticipating such a scenario? Right? When they take that oath, are they really actually taking upon themselves? You could say yes, and many do say yes, but many ethicists say, no, it's not really so clear that's the case. And it certainly isn't clear for the orderlies who are cleaning the hospitals, endangering themselves, or for the social workers or many others, right? So it's not so clear that Ravusner is correct that people took upon themselves in the 21st century when they became a doctor or a nurse, whoever it might be. But there's another argument, which I think is even more powerful and maybe even more important. And it's the argument that was given by the Tzitz Eliezer of Eliezer Waldenberg. And he was discussing the same exact issue. And he says, you know, in general, in principle, a person may not place himself in possibly life-threatening danger in order to save his neighbor's life, right? In other words, the general rule, as we saw for the average Joe, is that we don't expect them to put themselves in a safek pikuach nefesh, a possibly life-threatening danger to save someone else. However, he goes on to say, when discussing physicians, the law is somewhat modified. It is permitted for a physician to assume the risk of treating patients with any type of contagious disease. Indeed, he is credited with the fulfillment of an important religious duty, a mitzvah. Now, and then he goes on to say, when preparing to treat a patient with a contagious disease, the physician should pray to God for special guidance and protection since he is endangering his own life. Now, if you look carefully at the language, you'll notice that he says it is permitted for a physician to assume the risk, right? But it's not so clear that he's saying you have obligation. And he himself makes an analogy. And he says a military physician is permitted to render medical care to a wounded soldier in a combat zone, although he's endangering his own life. This applies even if it is doubtful whether the wounded soldier will live, die, or be killed. Similarly, another soldier is allowed to place his own life in danger in order to rescue a wounded comrade from the combat zone. And what you see from the Tzitz Eliezer's writings is that he makes that direct connection between the battlefield of the soldier and the battlefield against the plague, a battlefield against the infectious disease. And I think it's very telling to make such an analogy. And I think the question sort of becomes, what does that mean? What is he trying to get at? If you notice again in his language, he says, right, it is permitted. He has a hard time saying where this chiyuv, where that formal obligation comes to say you have to endanger yourself in this scenario. And I asked myself, well, why? Why is there such a hard time coming up with that source? But on the other hand, he's absolutely convinced that this must be the case. And I think what this relates to is a much broader and deeper and profound question when it comes to the issue of understanding duties and rights, right? Which is so important in our contemporary discourse. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what is it that's driving this notion of people saying that they take upon themselves, or people saying for others that you have this obligation, right, to treat in a time of a pandemic? I mean, I think it's been really amazing in Britain and many places around the world how we have not seen this phenomenon of physicians and other healthcare professionals walking out of hospitals, even though, right, they in many circumstances had a lot of good reasons to do so. I myself got a couple of questions from students, from friends who felt they were in scenarios in various cities when the outbreak was really bad a couple of months ago, where they felt like this is just crazy. Like, why am I doing this? And here I think the framework is so significant of what halacha does. Because as we saw, the framework in halacha is about duties. It's about the obligation I have to save others and the obligation I have to protect myself. What's absent here is a notion of rights, right? This notion of saying that I have a right to a safe workplace, or I have a right to walk off the job, or I have a right not to feel like I'm forced to go to work. Right? That discourse, which is very valuable in many ways, and we all benefit from it, that's so prevalent in Western societies, doesn't appear really in classic halachic literature. And I think in the circumstance that we find ourselves today, we're seeing a reintroduction in the popular society and understanding that it can't all be about rights. There also has to be a notion of duties, of responsibilities. And these responsibilities aren't just about ourselves, about what we are entitled to, but rather the responsibilities that we have to broader society. And all of us, of course, have to think about, well, what are our responsibilities to broader society in a time period like that we're living in right now, right? Every person in England, in Israel, in the United States, in Europe, wherever they are, right, needs to be asking themselves, what are my obligations and duties in this time period? What can I do to help others? What can I do to help broader society? And here, I think that this has been, I think, a eye-opening moment in the West in some ways, where the discourse of rights now has to be, in many ways, pushed aside in some respects, because we have to start thinking about this notion of duty, this notion of sacrifice for the greater good. And here, the healthcare professionals become the soldiers of our time period. And just as every society needs to have people to protect it physically when it comes to the outside enemies, and we have an understanding, you have a notion of codes, of honor, of virtue of the soldier, so too we have this notion of duties and responsibilities in the halachic literature, which imposes on an individual an obligation to endanger themselves, not as an individual, not because I have an individual obligation to save X, Y, or Z person in this circumstance, but rather because you have an obligation to save society as a whole and to do the duties and responsibilities and functions which you are uniquely trained to do. So for some people that's being a lifeguard, for some people that's being a firefighter, for some people that's being a soldier, and for some people that's being a healthcare professional. And I think therefore where halacha is so critical in the discourse that we have today is to emphasize and to re-emphasize this notion of duties. And I think that I want to stress, though, that this responsibility applies to all of us, meaning when all of us have to think about some of the individual dilemmas that we have today, right, with regard to economic questions, for example, and balancing that and getting the economy started or keeping it open, right, as opposed to questions of public health. So as individuals, all of us need to be asking ourselves, well, right, what is it that I can do to contribute to help out with this balance? And so if you're the average citizen like myself, one of the big critical questions you have to ask is, well, maybe I have an extra obligation to make sure that I'm balancing this well, I'm caring for the health of others. Because if you are demanding of healthcare professionals that they go into a hospital, right, endanger themselves in order to treat other people, at least you, as the average citizen, has the basic duty and responsibility, the chiyuv, to do the basic precautionary measures, masks, avoiding big groups, right? All the types of social distancing that people are talking about. There's a chiyuv here. I mean, how is it that you can actually expect to say that a healthcare professional should go into a hospital, but you don't have that basic obligation to do what the contemporary scientists are telling us to do, right, in order to prevent the spread of this disease? It's really mind-boggling in some ways when you hear people talk about they don't have to take the guidelines so seriously, go into quarantine, isolation, whatever it might be. That's just insane. It's just an insane perspective, which is focused on my rights to liberty, to move about and be, and not thinking about our duties to society. And so what I want to do in concluding now is to highlight the fact that I think that the halachic discourse here, which does call upon healthcare professionals to endanger themselves, is also part and parcel of a broader vision of society, which calls upon all individuals to think about the obligations and duties and responsibilities that we have to society. And right now, there's no doubt the healthcare professionals are on the front lines. And I'm sure, I hope all of us are very, very thankful to them for that element of self-sacrifice that they're making. But the same way we expect it from healthcare physicians, professionals, so too we should expect it and demand it from ourselves when it comes to what we can do to contribute to broader society. The other thing I'd mention here, and with this I'll conclude, I'm certainly happy to take questions, is that, when I talk about now, I've been talking about sort of these circumstances where there's a pandemic. We know how there are ways in which we can prevent it spreading, and we can help healthcare professionals avoid getting contact, avoid getting infected, but there's certainly a greater risk. Some people have asked me, since I have written about this in a few places and talked about a few places, well, what about a circumstance where society isn't providing the necessary protective care? Meaning when there are circumstances of severe shortages, right, of personal protective equipment, as there were in countries like Italy and Spain when the first the outbreak began. And here, I think it's much harder, frankly, to say that a healthcare professional would have such an obligation. And as I said earlier, I think the obligation stems not on an individual level, but from the obligation stems from people having unique contributions and roles in society. But society, of course, has to do its part as well in terms of providing as safe as possible of a work environment for those healthcare professionals. And therefore, I'll add, and for this I'll close, that we're really being tested right now as societies, as individual countries, individual communities, and really as sort of the global community, is to figure out how we can ensure that we can actually make these demands of healthcare professionals to be on the front lines of fighting COVID-19. Because just as we understand that there are times when soldiers will walk off the battlefield when they realize this is a suicide mission, isn't going to go anywhere, obviously we cannot, obviously we cannot anticipate and expect and demand from healthcare professionals to make those types of sacrifices when we're not, as a society, providing them with the basic protective equipment that they need. And so I hope and pray that we will continue as a society to work together and to provide each other with what is necessary to keep society functioning and healthy, to understand that we have the balance of duties and obligations and responsibilities right now. And I hope that will emerge out of this terrible plague, the silver lining, as it were, is that there'll be a renewed sense of duties and obligations, not just in times of plagues, but in all circumstances, in regular years as well. And that there'll be a renewed understanding that we can't just talk about rights, that we also have to talk about the duties and what we owe to society as a whole. Thank you so much. And if there are any questions that have come through, I'm really happy to take those.
Hi, you've only got time for one question, but it's again from a fellow doctor, Dr. Darrell Bernstein. He says the following: is it the case, therefore, that the duty of a medical professional is to help coronavirus patients applies regardless of whether PPE is available or not? So I guess the case would be there isn't PPE. Does the doctor have the duty to help that patient?
I mean, listen, I don't think that there's a level of chiyuv, of duty, of actual obligation in such a circumstance. Of course, doctors are different people, right? The cases that have some come up, you had people who are in the high risk of their own life, right? The doctors themselves who are a certain age, have certain medical conditions, which came up in Italy and other places where, I certainly heroic, but I certainly don't think it's an obligation. Whereas, if you have a younger, very healthy 25-year-old physician, that might be different. But again, we've seen people get severely sick who are younger as well. And I have a hard time saying there's an obligation in such circumstance. And I know, I think it's hard to say there's an obligation in that sense.
Okay, I mean, just another question just came in after. It's just literally coming from another doctor, Dr. Lawrence Lovat. He's asked the following: the death rate amongst healthcare workers is far lower than 10%. How high should the risk be for they're not obligated to work? I guess from a halachic point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time to quantify this. It's hard to know. I mean, and this came up with SARS as well, because SARS was so deadly, right?
Yep.
They came, I mean, right away. So it's hard to quantify it in this respect. I think that ultimately this is going to be a matter of the healthcare community in the given area feeling a sense of, okay, we can do this. Whereas if you get to the point where the healthcare professionals are just saying, like, I feel like I don't know if I'm coming home, today or tomorrow, next day or 2 weeks from now, because this is going to kill me. Once that becomes widespread, I have a hard time saying there's an obligation there. I do think it would certainly be permissible, right, for doctors then to make that self-sacrifice and take that risk, which I think is unique to doctors. I wouldn't tell someone to go just randomly visit their relative, right, in that circumstance. I think it would be forbidden for someone to visit their relatives in the hospital in that circumstance. But when it would be permissible for healthcare, professionals to risk themselves in that way, but it certainly wouldn't be obligatory. And I pray to God we don't get to that point.
Exactly. Thank you very much. I think for me, one of the real take-home sort of things from the share was, of course, this idea of duties and responsibilities. I think one of the things I always used to, I lived in America, and they have the Bill of Rights. And of course, Torah is all about obligations. It's I don't have a right to my property. I've got an obligation not to steal, and that sort of thing. I think you're absolutely right that hopefully society stresses the duties and responsibilities and the obligations they have rather than the rights and other things. I think we'd have a much better society if that was how the world followed. But thank you so much for a fascinating and far-reaching talk, and shows that the pandemic is nothing new, unfortunately, to the world. And of course, halachis throughout the centuries have had what to say, and really beautifully put together. And again, with technology, to read your source sheets and to hear you and see you was wonderful to see. So thank you very much. And I would encourage everybody to purchase your book, which again was a win in 2014 for the on contemporary issues. So thank you very much indeed. And again, just to remind you, for next week, we have Rabbi Dr. Stu Halpern with his talk, The Lion, the Pit, and the Wardrobe, Daniel, Joseph, and Esther, and the struggles of being a diaspora Jew. So again, another fascinating talk from a fantastic author from Cohen. Wonderful again to work with Cohen on the series. And we've had another treat tonight with dealing with the current issues of the pandemic and the halachic issues of being a doctor. So thank you everyone for joining us. Look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good week. And as we say nowadays, stay safe.